The camera clicked steadily, capturing frame after frame, as Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout's F-6F Hellcat fighter swept across the sky above Peleliu at 8,000 feet on September 12, 1944. His mission seemed straightforward enough: fly over the northern airfield, take photographs, and return safely to the USS Hornet, waiting in the waters below. Intelligence officers had briefed him confidently that morning, assuring him the airfield was abandoned, likely torn apart by earlier bombing runs, nothing more than empty concrete and twisted metal. But then Stout looked down through his cockpit window, and in that single moment, his blood turned ice cold. The airfield stretching out beneath him wasn't abandoned at all. It was absolutely packed with Japanese aircraft, row after row of deadly Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima bombers. Dozens of them lined up so close their wingtips nearly touched, with massive fuel drums stacked in perfect rows beside them and ground crews swarming like ants around every single plane. They weren't damaged. They weren't hiding. They were preparing for something big, something terrible. Stout's experienced eyes counted quickly, his heart pounding faster with each pass. At least 40 aircraft, fully armed, fully fueled, and he knew exactly what they were waiting for. In just 3 days, 28,000 United States Marines would storm the beaches of Peleliu in one of the largest and most dangerous amphibious assaults of the entire Pacific War, with the invasion fleet already steaming steadily toward the island at that very moment. These 40 Japanese aircraft sitting below him weren't just a threat. They were positioned perfectly to massacre those Marines before they could even reach the shore, to turn the ocean red before the first boot touched sand. Stout's training had taught him clear rules: spot enemy forces, radio the coordinates back to command, return to base safely, and let the officers decide how to respond. A reconnaissance pilot's job was simple: observe and report. Never engage, especially not alone against an entire enemy airfield bristling with anti-aircraft guns ready to tear any plane from the sky. But Stout also understood how military bureaucracy worked, how the chain of command could strangle urgency with procedure. By the time he landed his Hellcat, climbed down, filed his detailed report, and command assembled a proper strike package with multiple aircraft and escort fighters, precious hours would slip away, maybe even a full day. And in that time, the Japanese would scatter these planes, hide them in protected positions carved into the island, or worse, launch them directly against the approaching American fleet. The Marines who would be landing on those beaches in 3 days didn't have time for proper procedure, for forms and approvals and carefully planned missions. They needed these planes destroyed right now, not tomorrow, not 6 hours from now, but in the next few minutes. Stout circled higher, his mind racing as he studied the layout spreading beneath him, and he noticed something critical, something the Japanese had overlooked in their rush to prepare. The aircraft were packed dangerously close together, surrounded by those exposed fuel drums sitting out in the open with no protection whatsoever. One good hit, one lucky strike could start a chain reaction that would consume the entire field in flames. He checked his ammunition counter: 6 .50-caliber Browning machine guns, 2,400 rounds total, which gave him roughly 12 seconds of sustained fire. Not nearly enough ammunition to destroy 40 aircraft one by one, but maybe, just maybe enough to light one very big fuse. Before we continue with this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from right now and what you already know about the Battle of Peleliu. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd ever heard about Cowboy Stout's unbelievable attack before today. Robert Stout wasn't some reckless hotshot pilot looking for glory. At 28 years old, he'd already survived 63 combat missions over the Pacific. He'd fought in dogfights against expert Zero pilots, attacked heavily fortified Japanese positions under withering fire, and landed his aircraft on carrier decks during storms so violent they kept less skilled pilots grounded in fear. He knew the razor-thin difference between true courage and pointless suicide, and what he was considering now walked that line very, very carefully. If he attacked that airfield alone, every single anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu would instantly target him, tracking his plane with deadly accuracy, and he'd be completely alone with no wingmen to suppress that ground fire or cover his escape route. His Hellcat was tough, built to absorb punishment, but one lucky shot to the engine or cockpit would send him spiraling into the jungle below with absolutely no possibility of rescue, no hope of survival. But if he didn't attack, if he followed orders and flew away, those 40 aircraft would launch in coordinated waves against the invasion fleet in 3 days, with Japanese pilots strafing the crowded landing craft, bombing the vulnerable transport ships, and turning those beaches into absolute killing zones where Marines would die by the hundreds before they could establish even a small foothold. Stout had seen with his own eyes what happened when Marines landed under enemy air attack. He'd flown close air support missions at Tarawa, where Japanese planes had wreaked absolute havoc on the first waves of landing craft, and he'd watched helplessly from his cockpit as enemy bombers targeted those crowded boats that couldn't maneuver or defend themselves, turning the water red with American blood. The decision crystallized in his mind in less than 30 seconds. Stout pushed his throttle forward firmly and rolled the Hellcat into a steep dive, watching his altimeter unwind rapidly as he dropped toward the jungle canopy below, his plan forming clearly in his mind. Come in fast and low, hit those fuel drums first to create maximum destruction, and get out before the anti-aircraft gunners could properly track his position. At 2,000 feet he leveled off smoothly and pushed the throttle to the firewall, feeling the Hellcat accelerate to nearly 400 miles per hour. The engine screaming at maximum power, every component pushed to its absolute limit. Trees blurred into green streaks beneath him as he dropped even lower, barely 50 feet above the jungle, threading between the tallest trees with split-second precision. And then suddenly, the airfield appeared through a gap ahead, opening up like a stage. Japanese ground crews looked up in confusion as this lone American fighter roared overhead, some freezing in shock, others diving desperately for cover. But none of them reached their anti-aircraft positions in time to stop what was about to happen. Stout lined up perfectly on the northern row of aircraft and squeezed his trigger firmly, feeling all 6 machine guns open fire simultaneously, their combined roar completely drowning out even his screaming engine. Bright tracers walked across the concrete tarmac in a deadly line, stitching through the thin aluminum skin of the first Zero like it was paper, and the fighter shuddered violently under the impacts as aviation fuel began spraying from ruptured tanks. Stout adjusted his aim slightly, shifting his fire toward a cluster of fuel drums stacked carelessly between 2 bombers, and the drums simply disintegrated under the hammering .50 caliber fire. Aviation fuel exploding in one massive fireball that instantly engulfed both nearby aircraft. The explosion was far bigger than even Stout had anticipated. Flames leaped 50 feet straight up into the tropical air, the blast wave physically rocking his Hellcat hard enough that he had to fight the controls as he pulled up desperately. Behind him, the fire spread with absolutely terrifying speed, like watching a lit fuse race toward dynamite, as the first burning Zero ignited the aircraft parked right beside it, and that fire spread to another, then another, each explosion feeding the next in an unstoppable chain reaction. Within seconds, half the entire northern row was completely engulfed in flames, with Japanese ground crews running in every direction, abandoning any desperate attempt to save the burning aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners finally reached their positions and opened fire frantically. But Stout was already climbing away hard, weaving his Hellcat side to side to spoil their aim, watching bright tracers arc past his canopy like deadly fireworks. He felt solid impacts shudder through his airframe as 20-millimeter rounds punched clean through his tail section. Warning lights beginning to flicker ominously on his instrument panel, but his engine kept running strong and smooth. He banked hard right, gaining precious altitude while circling back around for another look. And below him, the devastation already exceeded his wildest expectations. Nearly 20 aircraft were burning fiercely now, the flames spreading across the tarmac in an unstoppable river of fire, with thick black smoke boiling thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles in every direction. But on the southern end of the airfield, at least 20 more aircraft still sat completely untouched, waiting like sitting ducks. Stout checked his ammunition counter again. Half gone already. Maybe 6 seconds of firing time remaining. No more. And those anti-aircraft gunners were ready now, tracking him carefully as he circled, learning his patterns. Coming back for a second pass was essentially asking to be shot down, begging to be killed. But he rolled his Hellcat inverted and dove straight back down anyway. This time, the anti-aircraft fire was immediate and absolutely intense. No surprise or hesitation. Tracers filled the air around him like thousands of angry hornets, so thick he could barely see through them. He jinked hard left, then hard right, never holding a straight line for more than a second, never giving those gunners enough time to properly lead his aircraft. And still the Hellcat shuddered under more impacts, metal tearing somewhere in the fuselage with sounds he could hear even over the engine. Stout came in from a completely different angle this time, targeting the big bombers clustered on the southern end of the field, and his remaining ammunition hammered into those aircraft like an invisible fist, shredding control surfaces and puncturing fuel tanks with ruthless efficiency. He walked his fire carefully across a large fuel truck, which exploded with enough raw force to physically flip a nearby bomber completely onto its back like a toy. The secondary explosions started immediately and violently. Burning. Fuel from the destroyed truck spread rapidly to stacked ammunition crates, which detonated in a rapid series of thunderous blasts that shook the entire island. And the bomber's own ordnance began cooking off from the heat, tearing those aircraft apart from within in spectacular explosions. Within moments, the southern row was burning just as fiercely as the northern side, the entire airfield transforming into one massive inferno. Stout's guns suddenly fell silent, empty, every single round expended, and the Hellcat felt noticeably sluggish as he pulled up hard, the damaged control surfaces making the plane fight against him with every movement. More warning lights glowed red across his panel. Something was definitely leaking badly, leaving a thin trail of dark smoke behind him. But below his damaged aircraft, the entire airfield had become an inferno beyond imagination. Every aircraft, every fuel drum, every structure was being consumed by fire, the smoke column rising thousands and thousands of feet into the sky, marking the spot like an enormous funeral pyre. Stout pointed his damaged Hellcat toward the distant ocean and nursed it carefully back toward the USS Hornet, feeling the hydraulics gradually failing, making the controls increasingly heavy and unresponsive with each passing minute. Watching his oil pressure steadily dropping on the gauge, he wasn't even sure the landing gear would extend properly when the time came, but at least his engine was still running, still pulling him toward safety. The flight back to the carrier felt impossibly longer than the entire attack had taken, as adrenaline slowly faded from his system, replaced by the cold realization of exactly what he'd just done. He had directly disobeyed clear orders. Instead of simply taking photographs and returning like he'd been told, he'd single-handedly attacked an entire enemy airfield alone. And court-martial was a very real possibility now, perhaps even certain. He might face punishment from every officer between him and the admiral, but the alternative, watching those 40 aircraft massacre the Marines in 3 days, would have been infinitely worse than any punishment the Navy could possibly hand down. The Hornet finally appeared on the horizon ahead, and Stout radioed the tower to report his situation honestly. aircraft heavily damaged, uncertain about landing gear function, requesting immediate priority landing. The carrier turned sharply into the wind and cleared the deck completely, every crew member watching as this shot-up Hellcat approached. His landing gear extended partially, but only partially. One wheel simply wouldn't lock into position properly. He came in hot, faster than normal, and caught the second arresting wire hard, the damaged Hellcat slamming onto the deck with enough force to buckle metal and send sparks flying. Deck crews swarmed around the aircraft immediately, absolutely shocked at the extensive damage. The entire tail section was shredded like paper. The fuselage had over a dozen large holes punched through it, and the paint was scorched completely black from flying through multiple explosions. Stout climbed down slowly from his cockpit and found himself facing a growing crowd of increasingly angry officers. The air boss wanted to know immediately why he'd returned with combat damage from what was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. The squadron commander demanded to know why he'd broken strict radio silence, and the intelligence officer wanted to know what the hell had actually happened over Peleliu. Stout's report was remarkably simple and direct. The airfield wasn't abandoned at all. It was packed with aircraft preparing to attack the invasion fleet in 3 days. So he'd destroyed them. All of them. 40 aircraft completely gone. 8 minutes from start to finish. The officers just stared at him in stunned silence, and the intelligence officer asked him to slowly repeat that number. 40 aircraft destroyed by one pilot flying one aircraft, because that seemed absolutely impossible beyond belief. Reconnaissance photos confirmed everything the very next day. The northern airfield at Peleliu was completely destroyed, devastated beyond any hope of quick repair, with not a single aircraft remaining operational. Aerial photographs showed the burned-out hulks of exactly 40 Japanese planes scattered across a blackened tarmac. Fuel dumps transformed into smoking craters. Structures reduced to rubble and ash. Intelligence officers immediately revised their entire assessment of Japanese air strength on Peleliu. Instead of facing 40 deadly aircraft on D-Day, the Marines would hit those beaches with complete and total air superiority. The Japanese air threat eliminated entirely by one pilot who'd refused to blindly follow orders. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor in the entire military. And the official citation praised his extraordinary heroism and aggressive fighting spirit in attacking superior enemy forces completely alone. His decision to engage had directly saved countless American lives, though the Battle of Peleliu that followed was absolutely brutal, regardless of his heroic action. The Marines landed on September 15, 1944, and immediately faced some of the most intense, savage fighting in the entire Pacific War. As Japanese forces had fortified the island's coral ridges and cave systems, turning every single position into a deadly stronghold that had to be taken inch by bloody inch. The battle lasted over 2 months of continuous fighting and cost nearly 2,000 precious American lives, young men who would never return home. Yet without Stout's daring attack, the casualties would have been far, far worse, perhaps catastrophically worse. Those 40 Japanese aircraft would have attacked during the most vulnerable first hours of the invasion, when Marines were packed helplessly in landing craft and transport ships, unable to take cover or maneuver away from the bombs and bullets. Air attacks on amphibious assaults were absolutely devastating because the troops simply couldn't defend themselves effectively or find any real protection. Military historians later carefully calculated that Stout's solo attack probably saved somewhere between 500 and 1,000 Marine lives on just the first day alone, and his 8 minutes of intense combat had accomplished what an entire squadron of bombers might have achieved. And he'd done it at exactly the critical moment before the Japanese could scatter or hide their aircraft. After the war finally ended, Stout returned quietly to California and lived a remarkably normal life, rarely speaking about what he'd done over Peleliu that day. His children grew up knowing their father had served honorably in the Pacific War. But they didn't learn the incredible details of his actions until decades later, when he was already an old man. The Navy Cross sat forgotten in a drawer somewhere, never displayed proudly on any wall, never shown off to visitors. Friends who knew him well described a humble man who was genuinely uncomfortable with attention or praise of any kind. And when people asked him about the famous attack, he'd simply downplay it casually, saying, "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them." Any pilot would have done exactly the same thing. But the truth was that not every pilot would have made that choice. Most would have followed their orders precisely, radioed the information back to command, and let the higher-ups handle it through proper official channels, through the established system. That bureaucratic approach would have given the Japanese precious time to scatter their aircraft or launch them against the fleet, and hundreds of Marines would have died as a direct result. Stout's willingness to disobey direct orders and trust his own battlefield judgment made all the difference between disaster and victory. His incredible story remained largely unknown outside specialized military aviation circles until historians rediscovered the old mission reports decades later, buried in archives. When researchers carefully cross-referenced his Navy Cross citation with captured Japanese records and aerial reconnaissance photos, they finally realized the full significance of what he'd accomplished that day. One man, one aircraft, 8 minutes of combat, 40 enemy planes completely destroyed, and potentially 1,000 American lives saved from certain death. The attack demonstrated something that military strategists still study carefully to this day: the immense value of individual initiative at the tactical level, the importance of trusting people on the ground. Stout couldn't have known for absolute certain that his decision was correct. He was making educated guesses about Japanese plans, gambling that his assessment of the threat was accurate, and betting his own life on his ability to execute the attack successfully. Everything about the situation argued strongly for caution and following procedure. Follow your orders, report back safely. Let someone with higher rank decide the proper course of action. But Stout understood instinctively that sometimes the person on the ground, seeing the situation with their own eyes in real time, has far better judgment than commanders looking at maps and reports miles away from the action. His willingness to trust his own assessment, even when it meant directly disobeying orders, perfectly embodied the military principle of commander's intent. The Navy hadn't specifically ordered him to attack that airfield, but they had sent him to protect the invasion force by any means necessary. He understood the deeper intent behind his mission and adapted instantly when circumstances demanded bold action. The Navy recognized this wisdom in awarding him the Navy Cross rather than court-martialing him for disobedience. They understood that rigid adherence to orders would have resulted in absolute disaster. Stout's disobedience was actually the highest form of following intent over strict instruction, spirit over letter. Modern fighter pilots still study Stout's attack in tactical training courses today, not just for the impressive flying skills it demonstrated, but for the decision-making under extreme pressure. And the military now teaches explicitly that sometimes following orders to the letter means missing critical opportunities that won't come again. The attack also demonstrated absolutely perfect target prioritization under pressure. Stout didn't waste precious ammunition trying to destroy 40 aircraft individually, which would have been impossible, but instead identified the fuel drums as the critical vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. One bullet in exactly the right place accomplished far more than 1,000 bullets in the wrong places ever could. His approach from multiple angles, coming in fast and low to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, showed tactical sophistication far beyond simply pointing and shooting. And he'd analyzed the defenses, planned his attack runs mentally, and executed them flawlessly despite taking heavy damage. And critically, he'd known exactly when to stop. After expending all his ammunition, he didn't loiter stupidly trying to assess damage or look for additional targets. He simply got out. The mission was accomplished. Staying longer would have been pointless risk, pure ego. All of these critical decisions happened in seconds while under fire with absolutely no time for careful deliberation or consultation. And Stout's training and combat experience let him make split-second choices that each proved correct. Robert "Cowboy" Stout died peacefully in 2005 at the age of 89, and his family finally shared his incredible story publicly, prompting military historians to rush to preserve the details before they were lost forever to time. The original mission reports, reconnaissance photos, and Navy Cross citation all confirmed what seemed almost too dramatic to believe, too Hollywood to be real. In the final analysis, Stout's attack over Peleliu stands today as one of the most successful solo strikes in the entire history of naval aviation. No other single pilot destroyed as many enemy aircraft in one mission during World War II. No one else came close. His 8 minutes of combat prevented what would have been a devastating air attack on the Peleliu invasion, and the Marines who landed on those beaches never knew that a Navy pilot had disobeyed orders specifically to save their lives. They fought through absolute hell on that coral island, facing Japanese defenders in fortified positions that turned every single yard of ground into a desperate battle. But at least they didn't face 40 aircraft strafing them mercilessly as they tried to reach shore. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is refuse to follow orders, not out of cowardice or rebellion or ego, but because the situation demands action that rigid adherence to procedure would prevent. Stout understood this instinctively, almost naturally, and when confronted with a choice between doing what he was told and doing what desperately needed to be done, he chose the mission over the orders, lives over regulations. His legacy lives on today in every tactical training course that teaches initiative over blind obedience, adaptation over rigidity, and trust in the judgment of skilled people on the ground who can see what distant commanders cannot. The military learned from Stout and pilots like him that sometimes the best course of action is the one nobody ordered you to take, the one that breaks all the rules. The next time you face a difficult situation where following the rules seems wrong, where rigid procedure conflicts with obvious necessity, remember Cowboy Stout circling over that airfield. Remember him looking down at those 40 planes? He knew what needed to happen. He knew it would cost him dearly if he was wrong. And he did it anyway because the alternative was worse. Because sometimes courage means trusting yourself when everyone else would play it safe.